This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we explore the ghost of competition past, a journey through the forgotten battles, the rivals who once loomed large, and the lessons they left behind. In this narration, we'll examine how past competitors shaped industries, drove innovation, and sometimes vanished into obscurity. From historic market showdowns to the strategies that defined eras, we'll uncover what these ghosts can teach us about competition today. Whether you're an entrepreneur, strategist, or simply curious about business history, prepare to discover insights from the rivalries that came before us. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Competition Past. In 1980, ecologist Joseph Connell published a paper in the journal Oikos with a title that would echo through ecological literature for decades to come. The paper was called Diversity and the Coevolution of Competitors, or The Ghost of Competition Past. The phrase itself had an almost literary quality, evoking Charles Dickens and spectral visitations from another time. Yet Connell was not trying to be poetic. He was, in fact, being deliberately provocative, even sardonic. The ghost metaphor captured something that had been bothering him about how ecologists explained the natural world. And he chose his words to make a point that many of his colleagues would find uncomfortable. The discomfort was intentional. By the late 1970s, competition had become the dominant explanatory framework in ecology. Whenever ecologists observed species dividing up resources or occupying different niches, they attributed it to competitive interactions. The ghost metaphor was designed to expose how casually ecologists invoked past competition to explain present patterns, often with little direct evidence. Connell was suggesting that his colleagues were seeing ghosts, conjuring spectral forces that might never have existed, or whose importance might be vastly overstated. To call something a ghost was to question its reality, to suggest it might be illusion or wishful thinking. This was not the kind of thing that made you popular at conferences. The metaphor stung because it implied that ecologists were engaged in a form of storytelling rather than rigorous science. Ghost stories, after all, rely on suggestion and interpretation rather than direct observation. They thrive in ambiguity. They cannot be definitively proven or disproven. By framing competition past as a ghost, Connell was challenging whether this central pillar of ecological theory was built on solid empirical ground or on elaborate speculation. He was asking uncomfortable questions about the difference between pattern and process, between observation and inference, between what ecologists could actually demonstrate and what they were willing to assume. The paper appeared at a critical moment in ecological thinking. Throughout the 1970s, ecologists had increasingly embraced the idea that competition between species was the primary force shaping ecological communities. Everywhere they looked, they saw evidence of species dividing up resources, occupying different niches, using different parts of the habitat. When two closely related species lived in the same place, they almost always differed in some predictable way. Perhaps one had a larger beak and ate larger seeds, while the other had a smaller beak for smaller seeds. Perhaps one foraged high in trees, while the other stayed near the ground. The conventional explanation was straightforward and elegant. These species had evolved to avoid competing with each other. Competition had driven them apart, allowing them to coexist. But Connell saw a logical problem that struck at the heart of this reasoning. If these species had indeed diverged to avoid competition, then by definition they were no longer competing. You could observe them today, measure their different beaks or their different foraging heights, and see that they used different resources. But you could not actually observe the competition that supposedly caused this divergence. It had happened in the past, perhaps thousands or millions of years ago. All that remained was the pattern, the differentiation itself. The actual competitive force that created it was gone, invisible, undetectable in the present day. This was the ghost. Competition past had shaped the species, molding them like a sculptor shapes clay. But the sculptor had left the studio. Ecologists were standing in the gallery, looking at the finished sculptures, and trying to infer the artist's technique from the result alone. Connell was pointing out that this inference was far more problematic than most ecologists wanted to admit. The genius of Connell's metaphor was that it captured both the appeal and the danger of this kind of reasoning. Ghosts are compelling precisely because they cannot be directly observed. They exist in stories, in traces, in effects that might have otherworldly causes. When you hear footsteps in an empty house, you might invoke a ghost to explain them. When ecologists saw species neatly partitioned in their use of resources, they invoked the ghost of competition past. Both explanations are tidy. Both are difficult to test. Both might be wrong. Connell was particularly troubled by how readily ecologists reached for this explanation. The logic worked like this. If two species overlap in their resource use, they must be competing right now. But if two species don't overlap much, that's because they competed in the past and evolved to be different. Either way, competition is the answer. Current competition explains current similarity in some traits and current differences in others, depending on the specific prediction being tested. Past competition explains clear differentiation without any observable competition happening now. The ghost could be summoned whenever it was convenient. Consider a concrete example that illustrates the problem. In many forests, you find multiple species of warblers, small insect-eating birds that all seem to occupy the same habitat. Yet when researchers watch them carefully, they discover that each species forages in a slightly different part of the trees. One species hunts primarily in the outer branches of the upper canopy. Another works the middle branches. A third focuses on the trunk and larger limbs. A fourth stays low near the ground. This partitioning is so consistent, so elegant, that it seems to demand an explanation. The ghost of competition past offers one. Perhaps when these warblers first encountered each other, they all tried to forage in the same places. Competition for insects was intense. Birds that happened to forage in slightly different locations had an advantage because they faced less competition from the other species. Over many generations, natural selection favored individuals who specialized in underutilized parts of the trees. Eventually, the species diverged so thoroughly that competition largely disappeared. Each had its own domain. This story is satisfying and plausible, but demonstrating that past competition actually drove this divergence presented fundamental challenges that would prove central to debates about the ghost hypothesis. Connell drew a crucial contrast that many ecologists had overlooked. Predators and their prey, parasites and their hosts, engage in relationships where one partner actively seeks the other. Predators search assiduously for prey. Parasites disperse vast numbers of spores to find hosts. This active dependency creates consistent encounters across evolutionary time. A specialist predator cannot survive without finding its prey, so natural selection strongly favors traits that improve tracking and capture. The prey, in turn, is under constant pressure to escape or defend. This reciprocal dependency locks the species together in co-evolutionary dynamics. Competitors, by contrast, do not depend on each other. They might compete intensely when they happen to overlap, but the interaction is fundamentally passive. Neither species is searching for the other. Neither needs the other to survive. If environmental conditions shift, or if one species disperses to a different area, they simply stop encountering each other. There is no evolutionary pressure to maintain contact the way there is for predators and prey. This asymmetry matters profoundly for coevolution. Connell argued that this passive nature of competitive encounters made coevolution between competitors inherently less likely than between predators and prey. The assiduously searching predator maintains contact with its prey across space and time. But competitors encountering each other is more a matter of circumstance than necessity. When circumstances change, the encounter ends, and whatever evolutionary pressures existed during the overlap cease to operate. The species might meet again later, or they might not. Evolution proceeds in response to whatever pressures are actually present, which for competitors might increasingly mean other selective forces entirely. This insight connected to Connell's broader argument about diversity. In ecosystems with many species, any two potential competitors are less likely to encounter each other consistently over evolutionary time. More species means more complex spatial distributions, more temporal variation in which species overlap, more opportunities for encounters to be interrupted by environmental fluctuations or dispersal events. Increased diversity, by reducing the consistency of co-occurrence, also reduces the chance of coevolution between competitors. Yet the prevailing theory held that competition drove the evolution of diversity itself. Connell suggested the causation might run the opposite direction. The ghost metaphor also carried a warning about the nature of ecological inference. Ecologists work primarily with patterns observed in the present. They see how species are distributed across landscapes, how they differ from each other, how communities are structured. From these patterns, they try to infer the processes that created them. But patterns don't speak for themselves. The same pattern can result from multiple different processes, and knowing which process actually operated requires evidence beyond the pattern itself. When confronted with species that occupy different niches, ecologists face a choice. They can assume this differentiation resulted from past competition and construct explanations based on that assumption. Or they can treat it as an observation requiring explanation and rigorously test competing hypotheses. Connell was advocating for the second approach, insisting that invoking the ghost of competition past should be a last resort, not a first assumption. Connell's skepticism was grounded in more than philosophical concerns about inference. He had surveyed the empirical literature and found that the evidence for competitive coevolution was remarkably thin. His three requirements for demonstrating that competition had driven divergence had been met, in part, in only one case as of 1980. This stark finding emphasized how readily ecologists were invoking a mechanism that had barely been demonstrated empirically. The ghost was everywhere in ecological theory, but almost nowhere in rigorously tested fact. The phrase caught on in ways Connell might not have entirely intended. Other ecologists began using it, sometimes to describe exactly the phenomenon Connell was skeptical about, sometimes to echo his skepticism. It became shorthand for a particular kind of evolutionary scenario. Competition drives divergence. The species become different enough that competition ceases, and we're left observing the aftermath without being able to see the process that created it. The ghost haunts ecological thinking because it represents both a plausible mechanism and an epistemological trap, a way of explaining observations that is simultaneously compelling and fundamentally difficult to verify. Over the following decades, the ghost of competition past would become one of ecology's most influential and contentious concepts. It would spark debates about methodological approaches to testing evolutionary hypotheses, about the temporal scales at which ecological interactions operate, about what happens when species encounter novel competitors to which they have no evolutionary history. Connell's deliberately provocative phrase had captured something essential about the challenges of historical inference in biology. The metaphor endures because it names a dilemma that ecologists cannot avoid. We study living systems shaped by processes that operated over timescales far longer than any experiment or observation can encompass. We see the products of evolution, but rarely witness the evolution itself. We infer history from its residues. The ghost of competition past represents both the power and the limitation of this inferential approach. It suggests that we can read evolutionary history in the traits and distributions of living species, but it also warns that such reading is fraught with difficulty, that patterns can mislead, that invisible forces are easy to imagine and hard to prove. Connell's ghost challenges ecologists to distinguish between what they observe and what they assume, between evidence and interpretation, between the patterns left behind and the processes that might have created them. Chapter 2. The Paradox of Proving Past Competition. The ghost of competition past presents ecologists with a peculiar methodological trap. To prove that competition drove species apart in evolutionary time, you must demonstrate that those species no longer compete in ecological time. The very success of the evolutionary process erases the evidence of the mechanism that drove it. This creates a paradox at the heart of character displacement theory. The absence of competition becomes evidence that competition was once crucially important. Consider what successful character displacement should look like. Two species meet and compete intensely for the same resources. Natural selection favors individuals that use slightly different resources, reducing competition. Over many generations, the species diverge. Their beaks become different shapes, their foraging behaviors specialize, their habitat preferences shift. Eventually, they use such different resources that competition becomes negligible or disappears. An ecologist arriving on the scene observes two species that don't compete, each occupying a distinct niche. The competition that supposedly drove their divergence is nowhere to be found. This inverts our usual logic for demonstrating cause and effect. Normally, to show that mechanism X causes pattern Y, we look for situations where X is present and Y occurs, and where X is absent and Y doesn't occur. We demonstrate causation through correlation, ideally via controlled experiments. But with the ghost of competition past, the logic reverses. We're trying to show that competition caused ecological divergence by observing situations where competition is now absent. The mechanism has eliminated itself. The paradox becomes most acute when we consider removal experiments. A straightforward test for current competition would remove one species and observe what happens. If the remaining species expands its resource use or changes its habitat preferences, that demonstrates competition was constraining it. This works well for detecting ongoing competition and has been used successfully many times in ecology. But what if you're testing for past competition that drove character displacement? The removal experiment collapses into paradox. Suppose two species really did undergo character displacement thousands of years ago. They evolved different beak shapes, different digestive systems, different food preferences, different search images, different everything related to foraging. These differences are now encoded in their genes and expressed in their development. They define what each species is. When you remove one species, the other doesn't suddenly start eating different foods or occupying different places. Why would it? It has evolved specializations that make it good at what it currently does and poor at what the other species does. The digestive enzymes in its gut work best on certain foods. The muscles in its jaw are optimized for particular feeding motions. The neural circuitry governing its foraging behavior has been tuned by generations of selection to focus on specific resources. The experiment gives you a negative result, no response to removal, which could be interpreted as evidence that competition never mattered. But the negative result might instead indicate that past competition mattered so profoundly that it drove irreversible evolutionary change. The absence of a behavioral shift following removal doesn't mean competition is unimportant. It might mean competition was so important that it restructured the species at a fundamental level. You're looking for an ecological response, but the response happened evolutionarily and is now locked in. This is the methodological trap. The signature of successful character displacement is the disappearance of the very evidence you need to prove it occurred. The more completely competition drove divergence, the less detectable that competition becomes in present-day experiments. You're trying to reconstruct an evolutionary process from its ecological endpoint, but the endpoint has been designed by selection to obscure the process that created it. Connell's original paper exposed this trap by outlining the evidentiary requirements for building a convincing case, revealing just how difficult proving causation would be even under ideal circumstances. Perhaps most fundamentally, you need to eliminate alternative explanations for divergence. Even if you can show that two species were once similar and are now different, and even if they became different in sympathy rather than isolation, you still must rule out other mechanisms. Perhaps they evolved different traits in response to different predators in sympatric areas. Perhaps sympatric and allopatric regions differ in climate or food availability in ways that favor different traits. Perhaps the divergence reflects genetic drift rather than selection. Perhaps one species was always adapted to shallow water and another to deep water, and they simply retained these ancestral differences when they came into contact. Over 70 cases of apparent character displacement have been described, yet in most cases, confirmation is lacking that resource competition even occurs, let alone that it drove the divergence. The pattern of ecological differences exists, but the mechanism remains uncertain. This statistical landscape reveals the scale of the problem. Dozens of cases show the expected pattern, but few withstand scrutiny when alternative hypotheses are rigorously tested.
Field experiments offer one potential solution. You could manipulate competitor density and measure selection on traits. If individuals with certain trait values survive or reproduce better when competitor density is high, and if those are the trait values characterizing the divergent population, that provides evidence competition selects for divergence. But this only works if competition is still occurring. If character displacement has already run its course and competition has largely ceased, you won't detect selection in present-day experiments, even if competition was the historical driver. You're back to the paradox. Successful displacement makes the displacement undetectable. The fossil record occasionally provides direct evidence of divergence over time. Some mollusks with excellent fossil preservation and detailed stratigraphic sequences show gradual divergence of shell morphology in ways consistent with character displacement. Species initially similar become more different when they occur together in the same sedimentary layers. But for most organisms, the fossil record is too fragmentary. Soft tissues don't preserve. Behavior doesn't fossilize. The subtle ecological differences that matter for competition, which part of a tree a bird forages in, which size class of seeds it prefers, leave no trace in stone. Without fossils, demonstrating that divergence occurred requires comparing populations at different geographic locations as proxies for evolutionary stages. If species A and B are completely separate in one location, just beginning to overlap in another, and fully sympatric in a third, you might arrange these populations in a sequence representing stages of divergence. But this assumes the populations are truly comparable except for their degree of overlap, an assumption rarely warranted. Geographic variation in climate, predators, parasites, food availability, and countless other factors could explain differences between populations without invoking competition. The challenge of geographic matching runs deeper than controlling for obvious environmental variables. Even when sites appear similar in temperature, rainfall, vegetation structure, and predator communities, they may differ in ways invisible to human observers, but crucial to the organisms involved. The seasonal timing of resource pulses might vary. The microhabitat distribution of prey items might differ. The background noise and acoustic signals might change. We can measure dozens of environmental variables and find no significant differences between sympatric and allopatric sites, yet the organisms might experience fundamentally different selective environments. Demonstrating a genetic basis for trait differences presents its own complications. Common garden experiments can show whether population differences persist in identical environments, indicating heritable variation. But even genetically based differences don't reveal what's selected for them. Any number of selective pressures could drive heritable divergence in beak size or foraging behavior. Competition is one possibility among many, and the genes themselves carry no record of which selective pressure shaped them. Molecular and genetic approaches have revolutionized our ability to reconstruct phylogenies, estimate divergence times, and identify genes under selection. These tools reveal much about evolutionary relationships and timing. But genetic data alone cannot identify selective pressures. You might determine that a gene affecting beak size experienced strong selection in one lineage, but natural selection doesn't record its reasons in DNA sequences. The molecular signature tells you that selection occurred, not why.
The ghost of competition past leaves no molecular fingerprint distinct from the ghost of predation past or the ghost of climate change past. The methodological paradox extends to how we interpret the absence of current competition. When two species partition resources so completely that they barely interact, this is often cited as evidence for past character displacement. The reasoning is that such perfect partitioning is unlikely to arise by chance. But the same pattern could arise if species evolved separately in different environments and happened to retain their ancestral differences when they came into contact. Distinguishing these scenarios requires knowing what the ancestral condition was, which brings us back to fossils or reconstructed ancestors we typically lack. The most rigorous test compares sympatric populations, where species co-occur, with allopatric populations, where they don't. If competition drives divergence, species should be more different in sympatry than in allopatry. This pattern has been documented in numerous cases. But even this geographic signature is ambiguous. The sympatric-allopatric comparison assumes that sites differ primarily in whether competitors overlap, when in fact they differ in countless ways. What looks like character displacement might reflect local adaptation to environmental gradients that happen to correlate with competitor presence.
At its core, the methodological paradox reflects a tension inherent to historical science. Evolutionary biology is fundamentally historical, seeking to understand processes that played out over timescales far exceeding any observation period. We cannot rewind the tape and watch evolution happen from the beginning. We can only examine present-day outcomes and infer past processes. The ghost of competition past epitomizes this challenge. We're looking for fingerprints of a mechanism that, if it worked as theorized, should have eliminated itself from the modern world. We're trying to prove something happened precisely because we can't observe it happening now. The burden of proof becomes retrospective. In experimental science, we can manipulate variables and observe outcomes in real time. In historical science, we must reconstruct manipulations that happened in deep time and whose outcomes have been overwritten by subsequent evolution. Every step of the inference chain involves assumptions. That our geographic samples represent temporal stages. That our environmental measurements capture relevant selective pressures. That our genetic data reflect adaptation rather than drift. That our behavioral observations reveal evolved preferences rather than learned responses. This doesn't make the task impossible, but it requires exceptional evidence. The case must be built from multiple lines of evidence, each insufficient alone, but collectively compelling. It requires acknowledging limitations and alternative explanations. Most of all, it requires recognizing that the absence of competition, the very pattern we're trying to explain, might be either the fingerprint of past competition or evidence that competition never mattered much at all. The methodological paradox ensures that distinguishing these possibilities remains one of ecology's most vexing challenges.
Chapter 3. Resurrection Ecology, using dormant eggs to directly measure historical competition strength across generations. The methodological paradox that Joseph Connell identified seemed, for many years, to be fundamentally insurmountable. How could ecologists possibly measure competition that occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago? How could they compare the strength of competitive interactions before and after character displacement without a time machine? The fossil record offered glimpses for a fortunate few groups with exceptional preservation. But for most organisms, evolutionary history seemed forever locked away, accessible only through indirect inference and ambiguous patterns. Then, in the early 2000s, a remarkable realization began to transform how ecologists thought about this problem. The solution had been there all along, buried in the mud at the bottom of lakes and ponds. Certain organisms produce dormant stages that can survive for decades, centuries, or even millennia in sediments. These dormant forms are not fossils in the traditional sense. They are viable, living propagules, suspended in a state of metabolic near death, waiting for conditions favorable enough to trigger their awakening. And when researchers learned how to resurrect these ancient organisms and pit them against their own descendants, they gained something ecology had never possessed before: a biological time machine that could reveal whether competition truly had weakened over evolutionary time. The organisms that made this possible were water fleas, tiny crustaceans of the genus Daphnia that inhabit lakes and ponds across the northern hemisphere. Daphnia are workhorses of ecological research, small enough to culture in laboratories, but complex enough to exhibit interesting behaviors and ecological interactions. They filter microscopic algae from the water, reproduce rapidly, and serve as food for fish and other predators. But the feature that made them revolutionary for testing the ghost of competition past was something that happens when conditions deteriorate. When a Daphnia population senses that winter is coming, or that the pond is drying up, or that food is becoming scarce, females switch their reproductive strategy. Instead of producing normal offspring that hatch immediately, they produce special resting eggs encased in a protective structure called an ephipium. These ephipia are extraordinarily tough, designed to survive freezing, drying, digestion by birds, and the passage of years. When they settle to the bottom of a lake, they become incorporated into the sediment, added to a growing archive of genetic diversity that accumulates year after year, generation after generation. Lake sediments accumulate in layers, like pages in a book, with the oldest material at the bottom and the newest at the top. If you core down through these sediments, extracting a cylindrical sample from the lake bottom, you're essentially collecting a chronological sequence of the lake's history. The ephipia trapped in different layers represent Daphnia populations from different time periods. And because ephipia can remain viable for surprisingly long periods, often decades or more, researchers can extract them from dated sediment layers, place them in favorable conditions, and watch as Daphnia from the past hatch and swim into the present. This technique, which came to be called resurrection ecology, offered a way around the methodological paradox. Instead of trying to infer past competition from present-day patterns or from incomplete fossil records, researchers could directly measure how competition strength changed over time. They could take Daphnia from an early period when two species first encountered each other, compete them against each other in controlled conditions, and measure who won and how strongly. Then they could take Daphnia from a later period, after the species had coexisted for many generations, and repeat the competition experiment. If character displacement had occurred, competition should be weaker in the later comparison. A team of researchers led by Christopher Steiner, working with Carla Caceres and Sigrid Smith at the University of Illinois, applied this approach to a small lake where three species of Daphnia coexisted. The lake's history, reconstructed from geological and biological evidence, suggested that it had been colonized by Daphnia in stages. First came Daphnia ambigua, establishing a population in the newly formed lake. This species became dominant, abundant throughout the water column. Then, sometime later, two other species arrived, Daphnia pollicaria and Daphnia dentifera. These later arrivals were larger and eventually came to dominate the lake, while Daphnia ambigua declined to rarity. This sequence fit the general pattern predicted by competition theory. An early colonist establishes itself, reaches high abundance, and then is displaced, or at least suppressed, when superior competitors arrive. But did competition actually drive the change? And if so, did the species evolve in response to each other, reducing the intensity of competition over time? The ghost of competition past hypothesis suggested they should have. Natural selection should have favored Daphnia ambigua individuals that could coexist with the later arrivals, perhaps by specializing on different foods or occupying different parts of the lake. If this happened, Daphnia ambigua from later in the lake's history should compete less intensely with the other species than Daphnia ambigua from early in the lake's history. The researchers collected sediment cores from the lake bottom and carefully separated them into layers corresponding to different time periods. From the deepest, oldest layers, they extracted ephipia of Daphnia ambigua from the period when this species was dominant, and the later colonists had not yet arrived or were just beginning to establish. From shallower, more recent layers, they extracted Ephipia from the period after the community had matured and all three species had coexisted for many generations. They also extracted Ephipia of Daphnia polychorea and Daphnia dentifera from various time periods. Hatching these Ephipia required patience and care. Not all of them were viable after their long dormancy. The researchers placed Ephipia in favorable conditions with appropriate temperature, light cycles, and food, and waited to see which ones would hatch. Gradually, Daphnia from different periods emerged, genetically identical to their ancestors, but now swimming in laboratory containers, ready to participate in experiments their progenitors could never have imagined. The key experiment was elegant in its simplicity. The researchers established competition trials pitting Daphnia ambigua clones against clones of the later colonists. They compared how Daphnia ambigua from early in the lake's history performed in competition versus how Daphnia ambigua from later in the lake's history performed. If character displacement had occurred, driven by selection to avoid competition, the later Daphnia ambigua should be better at coexisting. They should compete less intensely, perhaps because they had evolved to use different resources or tolerate lower food levels. The results were striking and unambiguous. Early Daphnia ambigua, the clones resurrected from the period when this species dominated the lake, were terrible at competing with the later colonists. When placed in competition with Daphnia polychorea and Daphnia dentifera, these ancient Daphnia ambigua went extinct. They couldn't persist. The competition was too intense, their competitive ability too weak. This made sense from a historical perspective. These were the Daphnia that had evolved in isolation, before the other species arrived. They had no evolutionary experience with these competitors. When suddenly thrust into competition with them in the laboratory, they lost decisively. But Daphnia ambigua from later in the lake's history told a different story. These clones, resurrected from sediments deposited after the species had coexisted for many generations, performed much better. They didn't go extinct in competition trials. They persisted alongside Daphnia dentifera, though they still struggled against Daphnia polychorea. The difference between early and late Daphnia ambigua was clear and significant. Something had changed over the generations of coexistence. Competition effects had weakened for at least one of the species pairs.
This weakening of competition over time was exactly what the ghost of competition past hypothesis predicted. Early in their association, the species competed intensely. Daphnia ambigua that happened to differ slightly from the other species in their resource use or physiological tolerances would have had an advantage. They would have survived better, reproduced more, passed on their genes. Over many generations, this selection would have pushed the Daphnia ambigua population to diverge, to become different from what it once was, different in ways that reduced overlap with the competitors. The beauty of the resurrection approach was that it provided direct evidence of evolutionary change in response to competition. The researchers weren't inferring past competition from present-day patterns, they were measuring it. They had resurrected the actual competitors from the past and watched them struggle against modern species. The early Daphnia ambigua lost badly, but their descendants learned, in an evolutionary sense, to coexist. The ghost had become visible, measurable, quantifiable in units of survival and reproduction. What exactly had changed in Daphnia ambigua was harder to say. The species might have evolved different feeding preferences, favoring slightly different sizes or types of algae. It might have evolved physiological changes that allowed it to tolerate lower food levels or different temperature regimes. It might have evolved behavioral changes affecting when or where it fed. The resurrection experiments demonstrated that evolution had occurred and that it strengthened the ability to coexist with competitors, but they didn't directly reveal the mechanistic details of that evolution.
Still, the achievement was remarkable. For the first time, researchers had directly measured the strength of competitive interactions across evolutionary time. They had shown that competition was initially strong enough to drive one species extinct, but that after many generations of coexistence, competition effects weakened for at least some species combinations. This was the signature of character displacement, the fingerprint that Connell had said would be so difficult to find. The ghost had been summoned from the sediments. The resurrection approach had limitations, of course. It worked only for organisms that produced dormant stages capable of long-term survival. Daphnia were ideal, but many organisms don't have this trait. Birds don't leave viable eggs in sediments. Trees don't produce seeds that remain viable for centuries. Even among organisms that do produce dormant stages, not all of them survive long enough or in sufficient numbers to make resurrection feasible. The technique required lakes or ponds with undisturbed sediments that accumulated in clear chronological layers. It required that the dormant stages had not degraded too much over time. It required careful extraction, identification, and culturing. And it required that competition could be measured in the laboratory, which might not reflect competitive interactions in the wild. There was also the question of how representative the resurrected individuals were. Not all Ephipia hatched successfully. Those that did might not be a random sample of the historical population. Perhaps only the most robust Ephipia survived dormancy, potentially biasing the results. The researchers acknowledged these concerns, but argued that they were unlikely to explain the clear pattern of declining competition strength over time. Despite these limitations, resurrection ecology opened new possibilities for studying evolution in real time. Or, more precisely, studying evolution that had occurred in real time by resurrecting the players from different moments in that timeline. Other researchers began applying the technique to different systems and different questions. Some resurrected phytoplankton to study how they evolved in response to changing nutrient conditions. Others resurrected bacteria to track the evolution of antibiotic resistance. Still others used resurrection to study how organisms adapted to climate change by comparing clones from different decades. For the specific question of the ghost of competition past, resurrection ecology offered something precious, ground truth. It transformed what had been an almost philosophical debate about whether competition shaped evolutionary divergence into an empirical question that could be answered with data. The Daphnia study didn't prove that competition always drives character displacement or that all niche partitioning arose from past competition. But it did prove that competition could drive measurable evolutionary change over accessible timescales, and that this change resulted in weaker competitive interactions between species that had co-evolved together. The technique also highlighted something important about evolutionary timescales. The changes in Daphnia competition strength occurred over periods measurable in decades or centuries, not millions of years. This suggested that character displacement might be a relatively rapid process in some systems, fast enough that its fingerprints shouldn't be completely erased by subsequent evolution. The ghost might be recent enough to detect if we knew where and how to look. Perhaps most importantly, resurrection ecology vindicated Connell's skepticism while simultaneously showing a path forward. Connell had been right that demonstrating past competition from present-day patterns was fraught with ambiguity. Simply observing that species don't compete now doesn't prove they competed in the past. But resurrection offered a way to directly test the key prediction, that competition should decline as character displacement proceeds. The past could be brought into the present, measured, quantified, and compared to later periods. The ghost could be made to speak, to testify about its own existence and influence. The Daphnia swimming in those laboratory containers, resurrected from their long sleep in the mud, represented more than just an experimental population. They were evidence that evolutionary history is not entirely erased, that the past sometimes preserves itself in forms we can recover and interrogate. They proved that the ghost of competition past need not remain forever invisible, forever inferred but never directly observed. With the right organism, the right preservation, and the right experimental design, the ghost could be resurrected, brought back from the sediments, and forced to reveal its secrets. Chapter 4. When the Environment Won't Hold Still. The ghost of competition past requires something that nature does not always provide: consistency. For two species to co-evolve in response to each other, they must encounter each other predictably, generation after generation, in conditions stable enough that natural selection can accumulate changes in the same direction over evolutionary time. But the natural world is not always so obliging. Environments fluctuate. Populations boom and crash. Droughts come and go. Fires sweep through forests. Lakes freeze and thaw. And when conditions change rapidly or unpredictably enough, the ghost never materializes in the first place. The evolutionary sculptor never gets the chance to finish the work, because the clay keeps shifting under the tools. As Connell noted, temporal consistency of encounter is more assured for predators and parasites than for competitors who are not mutually dependent on each other. This insight has profound implications for when we should expect to see character displacement. It suggests that niche partitioning should be most likely in environments that are stable and predictable, where species encounters remain consistent over many generations. Conversely, in environments subject to strong temporal variability, the ghost should be weak or absent. Niche partitioning patterns that we observe might reflect not past competition, but simply the different ways species happen to respond to a fluctuating environment. Consider what happens in a simple model of two competing species inhabiting two different habitat types. Imagine a landscape with both open meadows and dense forest. Species A and Species B both can use either habitat, but suppose each is slightly better adapted to one or the other due to their evolutionary history before they met. Species A grows a bit faster in meadows. Species B does slightly better in forests. If conditions remain stable year after year, competition theory predicts they should evolve to partition the habitats more completely. Species A should become increasingly specialized on meadows, developing traits that make it excel there. Species B should specialize on forests. Over time, the species diverge, competition between them weakens, and we observe the classic ghost pattern: two species, each in its own habitat, apparently shaped by past competition to avoid each other. But now introduce temporal variability. Suppose that some years are wet and some are dry, and this affects which habitat is more productive. In wet years, forests produce abundant food, while meadows become waterlogged and poor. In dry years, meadows flourish, while forests become desiccated and unproductive. Now the best strategy for each species becomes more complex. Specializing completely on one habitat means risking starvation in years when that habitat performs poorly. The species that can use both habitats, switching between them as conditions dictate, might actually do better than a specialist. Models of habitat selection under temporal heterogeneity reveal something surprising. When population dynamics are stable, meaning populations reach predictable equilibrium densities year after year, the ghost of competition past can emerge. Species partition habitats cleanly. They avoid each other. But with unstable population dynamics, where populations fluctuate strongly from year to year due to environmental variability, the ghost vanishes. Habitat partitioning breaks down. Dispersal between habitats becomes the evolutionarily stable strategy because it provides insurance against temporal variation. Species that were on their way to specializing on different habitats reverse course evolutionarily. They become generalists again, using both habitats, encountering each other regularly, competing actively in the present tense. This is not just a theoretical possibility. Studies of species pairs that appeared to show character displacement have revealed that the strength of habitat partitioning varies with environmental conditions. In stable years, the species separate neatly. In variable years, they overlap more. The ghost flickers in and out of existence depending on how consistent the environment remains. The phenomenon extends beyond simple habitat choice to any trait that might undergo character displacement. Consider body size, a classic trait that often differs between competing species. If one species evolves to be larger and the other smaller, reducing competition for food items of intermediate size, this divergence requires that being large or being small remains consistently advantageous generation after generation. But if food availability fluctuates strongly, the optimal body size might change from year to year. In years when food is scarce, perhaps small body size is favored because small individuals need less food. In years when food is abundant, perhaps large body size is favored because large individuals can defend territories more effectively or access high-quality food patches that small individuals cannot reach. Under such fluctuating selection, body size might evolve not toward divergence between species, but toward whatever size best handles the environmental variation. If both species face the same pattern of fluctuation, they might both evolve in similar directions rather than diverging. The ghost never forms because the selective landscape keeps shifting. What looked like it might become character displacement in a stable environment becomes instead a case of parallel adaptation to environmental variability. Temporal heterogeneity affects not just whether species co-evolve, but also the time scales over which we should expect to see evolutionary responses. Rapid environmental fluctuations, changing within a few generations, might prevent any cumulative evolutionary change at all. The environment never stays constant long enough for selection to push populations in a consistent direction. Slower fluctuations, changing over many generations, might allow some evolution to occur during stable periods, only to have it reversed or erased during unstable periods. The pace of environmental change relative to generation time becomes critical. This creates a filtering effect on which species pairs are most likely to show the ghost of competition past. Long-lived species with slow generation times might experience their environment as relatively stable, even when it fluctuates on decadal timescales, because those fluctuations are short relative to their generation time. They have time to evolve in response to their competitors. Short-lived species with rapid generation times might experience the same environment as wildly variable, with conditions changing multiple times within their evolutionary response time. For them, the ghost never has a chance to form. There's a particular irony here. The very species that might benefit most from character displacement, those that reproduce rapidly and could theoretically evolve quickly in response to competition, are also the species most likely to experience their environment as temporally heterogeneous. Their fast generation times mean they see environmental fluctuations as frequent and unpredictable. Meanwhile, long-lived species that evolve slowly might experience a more stable selective environment, but they take so long to respond that by the time divergence occurs, other factors may have intervened. The box tree moth provides an example of how temporal dynamics complicate competitive interactions even within a single growing season. These moths are multivoltine, meaning they produce multiple generations per year. The larvae of the first generation feed on box trees in spring, damaging the foliage. When the second generation of larvae emerges later in the same growing season, they encounter plants that were previously attacked by their own species. Experiments revealed a negative correlation between the number of egg clutches laid on plants by the first generation and the performance of the next generation larvae. This is intraspecific competition separated in time. The first generation reduces resource quality for the second generation. But here's the twist. Female moths laying eggs for the second generation showed no preference for undamaged plants over damaged ones. Their oviposition behavior didn't match the performance of their offspring. This mismatch suggests that selection has not yet shaped moth behavior to avoid plants damaged by earlier generations. Why not? Perhaps because the pattern of damage varies too much from year to year. Some years might have strong first-generation populations that heavily damage many plants. Other years might have weak first generations that leave most plants relatively untouched. If the selective pressure varies from year to year, consistent evolutionary responses become difficult. This within-season temporal dynamic hints at a broader principle. Competition separated in time is less likely to drive coevolution than competition occurring simultaneously. When two species encounter each other at the same moment, competing for the same resources right now, selection can favor immediate divergence. But when competition occurs sequentially, with one cohort depleting resources before the next cohort arrives, the second cohort might experience more variable conditions. The strength of competition depends on how successful the first cohort was, which might vary unpredictably. This variability weakens selection for divergence.
Aquatic ecosystems illustrate these principles through seasonal cycles. Many temperate lakes undergo dramatic changes through the year. In summer, they stratify into distinct temperature layers. Zooplankton populations boom. Algae flourish. Competition for light, nutrients, and food can be intense. In winter, the lake mixes, temperatures drop, productivity plummets. The competitive environment is completely different. Species that might be strong competitors in summer might barely encounter each other in winter because their populations crash or they enter dormancy. Year-to-year variation in precipitation, temperature, and nutrient inputs adds another layer of unpredictability that can prevent stable competitive outcomes from establishing. Similarly, in fire-prone Mediterranean ecosystems, vegetation burns every few decades, resetting community structure. After a fire, the plant community goes through succession. Early colonists are often different species than late successional dominants. Competition between plants might be intense at any given stage of succession, but the identity of the competitors keeps changing. A shrub species competing with grasses immediately after fire faces different competitors 20 years later when the shrub canopy has closed. If fires reset the system every few decades, no stable competitive equilibrium is ever reached. The ghost has no chance to form because the community composition keeps being shuffled. These examples illustrate general principles about how disturbance and environmental variability can disrupt the temporal consistency needed for character displacement.
The implications extend to conservation and invasion biology. Ecosystems subject to increasing environmental variability due to climate change might experience breakdown of historical niche partitioning. Species that evolve to partition resources under stable conditions might find those specializations maladaptive when conditions fluctuate unpredictably. They might be forced back into overlapping niches, increasing current competition even though past competition drove them apart. The ghost dissolves under the pressure of environmental instability. Invasive species entering such systems face a different competitive landscape than they would in a stable environment. If native species have evolved strong habitat partitioning under historically stable conditions, an invader might find empty niche space that it can exploit. But if environmental instability is breaking down that partitioning, forcing native species back into generalist strategies, the invader might face stronger competition from natives that are already present across multiple habitats. The ghost's presence or absence changes what invasions look like and how successful they're likely to be. There's a temporal scale issue that runs through all of this. Character displacement is an evolutionary process, requiring many generations to produce substantial divergence. But environmental conditions can change on ecological timescales, within years or decades. When the pace of environmental change exceeds the pace of evolutionary response, adaptation lags behind environmental shifts. Species are always playing catch-up, never quite reaching the character displacement that competition theory predicts they should evolve.
This lag creates an asymmetry. It's relatively easy for environmental change to erase the ghost of competition past. A few generations of strong environmental fluctuation can break down habitat partitioning that took hundreds of generations to evolve. But rebuilding that partitioning once environmental stability returns takes time. The evolutionary responses are not instantly reversible. This means that periods of instability might have disproportionate effects on niche structure, erasing ghosts faster than stable periods can create them. Mathematical models exploring these dynamics reveal threshold effects. Below a certain level of environmental variance, coevolution proceeds much as classical theory predicts. Species diverge, competition weakens, the ghost emerges.
Above that threshold, character displacement becomes impossible. The environment is too unstable. Selection pressures change direction too often. Evolution cannot build coherent responses. Interestingly, the threshold varies depending on how strongly the species compete in the first place. Weak competitors can co-evolve even in moderately variable environments because the selective pressure, though weak, remains consistent in direction. Strong competitors might require very stable environments because the intense selection they impose on each other can only drive sustained divergence if conditions remain predictable. This means the ghost of competition past should be most visible in stable environments, where species compete strongly enough to impose consistent selection, but not so strongly that one simply excludes the other before evolution can occur. This is a relatively narrow window. Many natural systems fall outside it, experiencing either too much environmental variation or competition that's too weak or too strong. The ghost is expected in some circumstances, but not others, and temporal heterogeneity is a major factor determining which systems should show its signature and which should not. When ecologists observe species that overlap extensively in resource use, they face an interpretive challenge. Does the overlap mean competition was never strong enough to drive divergence? Or did the species once diverge only to have environmental instability break down the partitioning? Or are they currently in the process of diverging, but we're observing them before the process has gone far enough to be obvious? Or do they simply experience their environment as too variable for stable coevolution to occur? Without additional evidence, patterns of overlap remain ambiguous. The ghost might be absent because it never formed, or because it formed and then vanished, or because we're looking at the wrong timescale. The vanishing ghost reminds us that evolution is not a one-way ratchet. Traits can evolve and then reverse. Specializations can develop and then break down. Niche partitioning can emerge and then collapse. The ghost of competition past represents a particular evolutionary outcome that requires particular environmental conditions to maintain. When those conditions change, the ghost can fade, leaving behind species that must compete in the present because the environment no longer permits the luxury of divergence. Chapter 5. Evolutionary naivety and invasion species shaped by the ghost of competition past face unique vulnerabilities when encountering novel competitors. The very specializations that allowed native species to coexist, refined through millennia of character displacement, become liabilities when invasive species arrive from ecosystems with entirely different evolutionary rules. This creates conservation challenges that standard habitat protection cannot address. Island ecosystems reveal this vulnerability in its starkest form. On Guam, the brown tree snake arrived sometime in the late 1940s, likely as a stowaway in military cargo. The snake encountered forest birds that had never evolved alongside tree-climbing predators. Species like the Guam flycatcher, the Guam rail, and the Micronesian kingfisher had no behavioral defenses against nocturnal predators that hunted in vegetation. Within 4 decades, 10 of 12 native forest bird species went extinct in the wild. The birds' evolutionary history had prepared them for aerial predators like hawks, but tree snakes exploited vulnerabilities that millions of years of island evolution had never selected against. The Hawaiian honeycreepers illustrate how past competitive relationships shape current vulnerability. These birds radiated into dozens of species, each with distinctive bill shapes reflecting specialization on different food sources. Phylogenetic analysis shows this diversification was driven by competition among the honeycreepers themselves. Species that coexisted on the same island diverged in bill morphology through character displacement, creating specialists. The Akiapolao with its woodpecker-like bill, the iwi with its long curved bill for tubular flowers, the palila with its heavy bill for crushing seeds. Each species became exquisitely adapted to its niche, shaped by ghosts of past competition with other honey creepers. When rats, mosquitoes carrying avian malaria, and invasive plants arrived, the honey creeper specializations offered no protection. Species that had evolved to feed on specific native plants found those plants being outcompeted by aggressive introduced species like strawberry guava and Coster's curse. The Maui parrotbill, specialized for extracting beetle larvae from native trees, cannot effectively exploit alternative food sources when those trees decline. Its bill shape, its foraging behavior, its habitat preferences all reflect evolutionary commitments to a specific ecological role. More than 30 honeycreeper species have gone extinct since human arrival in Hawaii, with most remaining species critically endangered.
The phylogenetic signatures of past competition in island plants reveal similar patterns. On the Canary Islands, analysis of endemic plant radiations shows that related species occupying the same island consistently differ in traits related to water use, nutrient uptake, and light requirements. These differences reflect character displacement that occurred as species diverged from common ancestors. The current distribution of traits across the phylogeny provides evidence that competition structured these evolutionary radiations. But this evolutionary history was specific to competition among native Canary Island plants, not to the European grasses, North African succulents, and South American shrubs that would later arrive. The temporal asymmetry compounds the problem. When the Asian shore crab invaded New England waters in the 1980s, native mud crabs had no evolutionary preparation for this competitor. The Asian crabs tolerate wider temperature ranges, consume a broader diet, and reproduce more prolifically than natives. By the time selection might favor native crabs with traits useful for competing with the invader, native populations had already declined sharply across their range. Evolutionary change requires variation, time, and population sizes large enough to maintain genetic diversity. Rapid invasion removes all three prerequisites.
The ghost of predation past created parallel vulnerabilities when humans spread across continents during the late Pleistocene. Large mammals in the Americas, Australia, and islands had evolved defenses against predators operating under constraints the mammals understood evolutionarily. Predators hunted from within striking distance. They attacked in predictable ways based on their anatomy. Prey species had evolved vigilance behaviors, flight responses, and defensive postures matched to these specific threats. Human hunters operated outside these evolutionary rules. Projectile weapons killed from distances that made existing flight responses inadequate. Coordinated group hunting with complex communication exceeded anything prey had experienced from other predators. The use of fire to drive prey into ambushes or off cliffs represented a completely novel predation strategy. Most critically, humans adjusted their hunting tactics within individual lifetimes, adapting to prey behavior far faster than prey could evolve counter-adaptations. The result was catastrophic. Mammoths, ground sloths, giant wombats, moas, and dozens of other megafaunal species went extinct within centuries or millennia after human arrival in previously uninhabited regions. These were species that had persisted through dramatic climate changes and previous predator evolution, yet they vanished rapidly when confronted with a predator unlike any in their evolutionary history. The result was catastrophic. Mammoths, ground sloths, giant wombats, moas, and dozens of other megafaunal species went extinct within centuries or millennia after human arrival in previously uninhabited regions. These were species that had persisted through dramatic climate changes and previous predator evolution, yet they vanished rapidly when confronted with a predator unlike any in their evolutionary history.
Marine ecosystems demonstrate that even highly mobile species can show evolutionary naivety to invasion. The lionfish invasion of the Caribbean and Atlantic began in the 1980s, likely from aquarium releases off the Florida coast. Native reef fish had no evolutionary experience with this Indo-Pacific predator. Lionfish possess venomous spines that deter most predators, hunt with tactics unfamiliar to Caribbean prey species, and consume juvenile fish at rates that suppress native recruitment.
Studies using stable isotope analysis, measuring nitrogen-15 and carbon-13 ratios in fish tissue, show that lionfish occupy overlapping trophic positions with native predators like grouper and snapper, but achieve higher densities and consume more biomass. Native prey fish show weak avoidance responses to lionfish, treating them as less threatening than native predators, even though lionfish impose higher predation rates. This mismatch between evolutionary preparation and ecological reality allows lionfish to dominate reef communities across the invaded range. The conservation implications are profound. Protected areas operate on the assumption that eliminating direct human impacts allows native species to persist. But protection from fishing, logging, or development does not protect against invasive species. The marine reserves established to conserve native fish populations in the Mediterranean cannot exclude the Suez Canal migrants that arrive through natural dispersal. The terrestrial reserves protecting Hawaiian forest birds cannot keep out mosquitoes or prevent the spread of invasive plants that displace native food sources.
Management strategies that ignore evolutionary history risk ineffectiveness. Habitat restoration projects typically focus on physical structure, planting native vegetation, restoring hydrology, removing pollutants. These interventions address proximate causes of decline, but not the ultimate evolutionary mismatch. If a native plant species has been shaped by past competition into a specialist with narrow germination requirements, simply restoring soil conditions may not enable it to compete with invasive generalists that germinate across broader environmental conditions. The ghost of competition past constrains the native's ability to exploit restored habitat. Some researchers have proposed assisted evolution or managed relocation as responses. If native species cannot adapt quickly enough to novel competitors, perhaps conservation should facilitate adaptation by breeding individuals with competitive traits, or move populations to refugia where invasives are absent. New Zealand's kakapo recovery program represents one version of this approach. The critically endangered parrots, which evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, are now restricted to predator-free offshore islands where intensive management maintains their population. But this is not conservation of self-sustaining populations in natural ecosystems. It is permanent intensive care for species whose evolutionary history left them unable to persist in the presence of rats, stoats, and cats. The alternative, accepting invasive dominance as a new ecological reality, has equally troubling implications. If specialists shaped by millions of years of character displacement cannot compete with cosmopolitan generalists, we face not just local extinctions, but global homogenization. The unique evolutionary products of isolated archipelagos and distinctive ecosystems get replaced by the same suite of human-associated species worldwide. Biological diversity accumulated through evolutionary time gets dismantled in ecological time. The core challenge is that evolution prepared species for competitive environments that no longer exist. When competitive relationships remained stable for thousands of generations, character displacement refined species into specialists occupying distinct niches. The ghosts of past competition structured communities through evolutionary divergence. But the stability required for this process has been shattered by human-mediated species redistribution. Native species now compete with organisms from different evolutionary theaters, bringing strategies shaped by different selective pressures. The native specializations, successful adaptations to historical competition, become evolutionary dead ends when the rules change faster than selection can respond. Their vulnerability to invasion is not maladaptation, but the consequence of adaptation to a world we have fundamentally altered. Chapter 6. Ghosts and the Living. When two species occupy different microhabitats within the same forest, different depth zones in the same lake, different foraging heights on the same trees, ecologists face a deceptively simple question: why? The observation seems straightforward enough. The species are partitioned. They use different resources. They don't overlap much.
But the mechanism behind this pattern divides into two fundamentally different possibilities, operating on entirely different timescales with profoundly different implications for how we understand community structure. The first possibility is competitive displacement. This happens in real time, in ecological time, as interactions playing out right now between living individuals. A dominant species actively excludes a subordinate species from preferred habitats through superior competitive ability. The subordinate doesn't use the dominant's habitat not because it evolved preferences for somewhere else, but because it gets outcompeted when it tries. The partitioning is maintained by ongoing competition. Remove the dominant species, and the subordinate should immediately expand into the newly available space. The effect is reversible, dynamic, a product of present-day ecological interactions. The second possibility is character displacement. This happened in the past, in evolutionary time, through natural selection acting across many generations. Competition between the species was once strong, but that competition favored individuals with different resource preferences. Over thousands of generations, the species diverged. They evolved different morphologies, different physiologies, different behaviors that led them to prefer different habitats. Now, even in the absence of active competition, each species sticks to its niche not because the other excludes it, but because evolution has shaped it to prefer that niche. The partitioning persists whether or not the competitor is present. The effect is evolutionary and coded in genes, a product of selection that occurred in the past. These two processes can produce identical patterns. Two species, neatly partitioned, using different resources, apparently avoiding each other. An ecologist surveying the community sees the same thing regardless of which mechanism created it. But the distinction matters enormously. Competitive displacement means competition is happening now, measurable in current populations, potentially manageable through current interventions. Character displacement means the competition is finished, its work complete, its signature visible only in the evolutionary divergence it left behind. The ghost is either active or genuinely a ghost. Ruby spot damselflies became an unlikely proving ground for this debate. These small, brightly colored insects inhabit streams and rivers across the Americas. Males are territorial, defending small patches of stream bank where they court females. Different species of ruby spot damselflies often coexist in the same stream systems, but they partition the habitat in specific ways. Some species prefer faster-flowing sections of stream. Others favor slower pools. Some stay close to overhanging vegetation. Others patrol open, sunny patches. The partitioning is consistent and obvious to anyone who watches them. Researchers studying these damselflies documented something intriguing. Species that responded more aggressively to each other in staged encounters differed more in their microhabitat use. This correlation between aggression and habitat partitioning suggested a link between competitive interactions and niche divergence. Species that competed more intensely had diverged more completely. The pattern fit what you would expect from character displacement. But it could also arise from competitive displacement. Perhaps species that were similar in habitat use competed more aggressively right now. And perhaps subordinate species were being excluded from preferred microhabitats by dominant species. The pattern alone couldn't distinguish between the possibilities. The removal experiments provided the critical test. Researchers selected 3 species pairs of ruby spot damselflies and conducted careful removal experiments at multiple stream sites. They removed the dominant species from experimental sections of stream and monitored how the subordinate species responded. If competitive displacement was maintaining the habitat partitioning, the subordinate species should shift into microhabitats previously occupied by the dominant. They should expand their range of perch heights, their use of different flow velocities, their positioning relative to vegetation. The dominant had been excluding them, so its absence should liberate them. The results were unambiguous across all 3 species pairs. Species-specific microhabitat use persisted after the experimental removals. When dominant species were taken away, subordinate species continued to use exactly the same microhabitats they had used before. They didn't expand into the dominance territory. They didn't shift their perch heights. Their habitat preferences remained stable despite the absence of the competitor. This was the signature of character displacement, not competitive displacement. The species had evolved intrinsic preferences for different microhabitats. Those preferences persisted whether or not the competitor was present.
This finding vindicated the ghost of competition past hypothesis in a fundamental way. The habitat partitioning observed among these damselflies was not being maintained by current competition. It was not a dynamic ecological phenomenon that could be reversed by removing competitors. Instead, it reflected evolutionary divergence that had occurred in the past. The species had been shaped by historical competition, but that competition had driven them so far apart that it no longer constrained them in the present. The partitioning was now part of their evolved biology. The damselfly experiments demonstrate that the ghost of competition past, while invisible in present-day interactions, can still be interrogated through removal experiments. By watching whether species shift their habitat use when competitors are removed, researchers can distinguish between partitioning maintained by current competition and partitioning resulting from past evolutionary divergence. Three-spine sticklebacks in British Columbia lakes offered a different experimental approach to the same question. Rather than removing species, researchers used a comparative design that exploited the natural variation in divergence among lake populations. They took advantage of the fact that marine sticklebacks still exist in coastal waters and are similar to the ancestral form that colonized freshwater lakes thousands of years ago. By measuring competition between marine sticklebacks and different lake populations representing early and late stages of divergence, researchers could test the prediction that competition between species should decline as character divergence proceeds, yielding descendants whose present-day interaction is a ghost of its former strength.
The experimental treatments simulated pre-displacement and post-displacement scenarios. In the pre-displacement treatment, marine sticklebacks were housed with intermediate lake populations that had not yet undergone extensive character displacement. In the post-displacement treatment, marine sticklebacks were housed with benthic specialists that had diverged substantially from the ancestral form through character displacement. The prediction was clear. If character displacement had weakened competition over evolutionary time, marine sticklebacks should experience weaker competitive effects from benthic specialists than from intermediate populations. The results supported this prediction. Marine sticklebacks showed faster growth rates and more specialized foraging behavior when competing with benthic specialists than when competing with intermediate populations. Competition had declined as divergence proceeded. This pattern was consistent with character displacement having reduced competition strength over evolutionary time. The intermediate populations, still similar to the ancestral marine form, competed more intensely with marine fish. The benthic specialists, having diverged away from the ancestral condition, competed less intensely. The ghost had indeed grown fainter as evolutionary divergence proceeded. The stickleback experiments revealed something important about the relationship between competitive displacement and character displacement. These processes are not necessarily mutually exclusive alternatives, but rather stages in a continuum. When species first encounter each other, competitive displacement may be the primary mechanism maintaining any habitat partitioning. Strong competitors exclude weak competitors from the best habitats. But if this situation persists long enough, natural selection favors individuals in the subordinate species that actually prefer the inferior habitats or that are better at exploiting them. These individuals experience less competition because they don't try to use the superior competitor's resources. Over many generations, what began as forced acceptance of second-best habitats becomes evolved preference for those habitats. This temporal sequence from competitive displacement to character displacement affects how we interpret community patterns. If we see species partitioned across habitats, we cannot simply assume this reflects stable evolutionary outcomes. It might be dynamic competitive displacement happening right now. The distinction influences predictions about how communities will respond to disturbance or species loss. If partitioning is maintained by competitive displacement, removing species should have immediate cascading effects as other species expand their habitat use. If partitioning reflects character displacement, removing species might have little immediate effect because the remaining species are locked into their niches by evolved preferences. The distinction influences predictions about how communities will respond to disturbance or species loss. If partitioning is maintained by competitive displacement, removing species should have immediate cascading effects as other species expand their habitat use. If partitioning reflects character displacement, removing species might have little immediate effect because the remaining species are locked into their niches by evolved preferences.
The distinction also affects conservation strategies. If endangered species are being excluded from preferred habitats by competitive displacement from invasive species, removing the invasives might allow the endangered species to recover immediately. But if the endangered species have already undergone character displacement in response to natives, they might not be able to quickly exploit habitats vacated by invasives because they have evolved specializations that limit their flexibility. Their evolutionary past constrains their ecological present. The experimental approach has limitations. Removal experiments are logistically challenging, requiring careful controls and multiple replicates. The response to removal might take time to manifest, even for competitive displacement, if individuals are philopatric, returning to familiar locations regardless of current competition. Conversely, even evolved preferences might show some plasticity, allowing limited expansion into competitor habitats after removal. The distinction between the two processes might not always be sharp in practice, even when it is conceptually clear. Moreover, the experiments test immediate responses to competitor removal, not long-term evolutionary outcomes. Even if a species shows no immediate shift in habitat use after competitor removal, it might evolve such shifts over many generations if the competitor remains absent. The character displacement that occurred in the past could theoretically be reversed by selection in the future if competitive relationships change. Evolution is not a one-way street. The damselfly and stickleback studies also highlight an asymmetry in how we gather evidence for these processes. Competitive displacement is relatively easy to detect when it occurs. Remove the competitor, observe an immediate shift in habitat use, and you have your answer. The positive result is clear and publishable. But character displacement is harder to demonstrate because absence of a response to removal is not definitive proof of evolutionary change. The species might not shift habitat use for other reasons unrelated to evolution. Perhaps it simply doesn't recognize the available habitat as suitable, or perhaps some unmeasured factor limits where it can persist. Proving that the lack of response reflects evolved preferences rather than ecological constraints requires additional lines of evidence. This asymmetry in evidence has likely biased the ecological literature toward documenting competitive displacement over character displacement. Cases of competitive displacement produce clear, positive results that are easier to publish. Cases of character displacement requiring demonstration of persistent habitat preferences despite competitor removal demand more comprehensive evidence and may be underreported. The ghost might be more common than the published record suggests simply because ghosts are harder to catch in the act of not acting. The patterns we observe in nature are products of both current processes and historical legacies. Competition happening now shapes species distributions through competitive displacement. Competition that happened in the past shapes species traits through character displacement. Both leave fingerprints in community structure, and those fingerprints often look similar. Teasing them apart requires careful experiments, multiple lines of evidence, and willingness to accept that the answer might be different for different species pairs, even within the same community.
For the ruby spot damselflies, the answer seems clear. The habitat partitioning reflects character displacement, evolutionary divergence driven by past competition but now maintained by evolved preferences rather than active exclusion. For other systems, the answer remains uncertain, awaiting experiments that have not yet been done or cannot be done with current methods. The challenge for ecology is determining which is which, distinguishing the ghosts from the living, the past from the present, the evolutionary from the ecological. The ghost of competition past reminds us that the natural world we observe today is shaped by forces we cannot see. Connell's provocative metaphor challenged ecologists to distinguish between what they observe and what they assume, between patterns left behind and the processes that created them. Through resurrection ecology, careful experiments, and critical thinking, we've learned that the ghost is real in some systems, absent in others, and vanishingly fragile when environments change. This matters beyond academic debate. Species shaped by millennia of coevolution face modern competitors with no shared evolutionary history. Conservation cannot simply protect habitats. It must recognize that evolution has prepared organisms for worlds that no longer exist. The ghost teaches us humility about inference, caution about assuming mechanisms, and urgency about preserving not just species, but the evolutionary relationships that allow them to persist. Perhaps the deepest lesson is this: we are surrounded by invisible sculptors whose work we can barely reconstruct, and we are changing the world faster than evolution can respond. Thank you for listening.